This is the Everyday AI Show, the everyday podcast where we simplify AI and bring its power to your fingertips. Listen daily for practical advice to boost your career, business, and everyday life.
Whether you realize it or not, research impacts our daily lives. From healthcare improvements to product development to educational strategies and workplace policies. Research shapes everything we do, experience, our day-to-day activities. But when it comes to AI use in research, specifically qualitative research, I think there's some aspects of this that we might be overlooking. So that's what we're going to be tackling today on Everyday AI. What's going on, y'all? My name is Jordan Wilson. I'm the host of Everyday AI, and we are your daily live stream podcast and free daily newsletter, helping us all not just learn AI, but how we can leverage it to get ahead, to grow our companies and our careers. If that's what you're trying to do, trying to be the smartest person in AI at your company or your department, you're in the right spot. It starts here with this live stream / podcast, but it continues on our website. So if you haven't already, please go to youreverydayai.com. So there, sign up for the free daily newsletter. We recap the podcast each and every day with some exclusive insights in that newsletter, as well as keeping you up to date with everything else that's going on in the AI world. So it's a one-stop shop for everything that you need. So make sure you go check this out. So if you are tuning into the podcast, looking for the daily AI news, technically we got a pre-recorded one that we're debuting live. So all of that AI news will be in the newsletter. So make sure to go check that out. All right, enough chit chat, y'all. I'm excited for today's conversation. I hope you are as well. So, hey, for our live stream audience, can you welcome to our show, Dr. Claire Moran, qualitative research educator and facilitator. Claire, thank you so much for joining the Everyday AI Show.
Hi, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. I'm excited. I'm excited to talk this one. But first, before we get into it, tell us a little bit about your background as a qualitative research educator. And we'll get into what that actually means, right? But tell us a little bit of your background.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm actually Irish, first of all, as I should probably say. You can tell by my accent. But I live in Australia, and I did my PhD here in Queensland at the University of Queensland in health psychology. So my PhD is in qualitative research. And over the last few years, what I've really noticed in my field is there tends to be a bit of a lack of training for qualitative research as well from PhD students. It's a kind of a funny situation. It's like if someone's going to be an apprentice plumber, but you said, okay, off you go, learn on the job for 4 years and then come back and I'll tell you if you're qualified or not. So there's not actually a lot of training for people who are doing PhDs. A lot of it is kind of trial and error, which can be really tricky. And there's quite, there can be kind of blind alleys and, self-doubt and all that kind of stuff. So, a lot of what I do in my work is running training for people who are doing PhDs. A lot of people who come to my training are also seasoned academics. But basically it's a space for qualitative researchers to come together and to do training, to learn from me, to learn from each other. So one of the most recent courses that I've started running is a AI and qualitative research training, because again, as we know, the speed of AI is so incredibly fast, and institutions can be really slow to move at the same pace. So we have this, situation where we have all of these tools, all of this kind of accelerated change, but researchers are often really unsure. Well, what does this actually look like for my research practice? What's okay, what's not okay. So, for me, part of doing training is, yes, the training, but there's a lot to be said as well for providing that space for people to come together and have those open conversations. And as I said, not just learn from me, but learn from each other. And I think that's, that's really powerful for people.
And maybe let's start a little bit at the beginning. So maybe for those that aren't, super in the know when it comes to how research works, or, what is a qualitative researcher? Let's start there. What the heck is a qualitative researcher, and how does it impact, our daily lives?
For sure. So I think when people think of research, we often think of quantitative research, which is when data can be kind of reduced to numbers, okay? Or we have a hypothesis and we're testing a hypothesis. And so when we're talking about that kind of quantitative research, we're talking usually about, definite answers or statistical significance. Okay. So, 2 + 2 = 4. You cannot tell me 2 + 2 = 5. Okay. So we have a definite and a clear answer. When we're talking about qualitative research, what we're talking about is meaning and meaning making. Okay. So what we're using as data as qualitative researchers is we're using words. And we can also be using things like images, but primarily our main form of data is words. So what we're focusing on is things like processes and experiences and how things happen rather than cause and effect and why. Okay. So within that kind of sense of meaning and meaning making, what we're also recognizing is that as the researcher, we are telling one story of a number of stories that could be told about a data set. Now, when I use the word story, that doesn't mean we're not engaged in rigorous practice. Okay. So, we're always striving to, produce excellent research, to do research in a really rigorous way. But nonetheless, being really clear on the fact that there is not one correct answer to a data set. Okay. So if you imagine, for example, if you had if you had some Lego, if you had some bricks, and so we recognize that we can configure these bricks in a number of different ways. Okay. So, which is correct? Is it this way or is it this way? So we recognize it's quite a stupid question because we can see that there's multiple ways that you can configure the bricks, and all of those ways are actually correct.
I love,
Right?
yeah, for our podcast audience, Claire just actually had some, jumbo Lego blocks. As weird as it is, I have a lot of experience with jumbo Lego blocks. Yeah, another story for another day. So, one thing, and maybe help us understand this, because I think that when people look at the quantitative side, they're like, oh yeah, it makes sense for AI to play a huge role in that, right? When you have your numbers, your data, etc. But when it comes to qualitative, when it comes to making sense, essentially, of unstructured data, where does AI play into this right now? So where are the, I guess, the areas where it makes a lot of sense to use AI responsibly in qualitative research?
Absolutely. So if we think about kind of, I suppose, the a research project. And so when, any researchers embarking on a research project, they obviously understand there's a lot of work that needs to go into actually getting the data in the first place. Then you have your data. So when you have your data, say, for example, if you're doing an interview or a focus group, you will have that audio data, which then needs to be transcribed. Say before AI, people, I think, don't realize how time consuming, for example, transcription is. So it actually takes about 8 hours to transcribe 1 hour of spoken words, right? So it's incredibly time consuming. And then we have, so obviously at the back end, in terms of, those kind of repetitive or organizational tasks, AI can be incredibly useful. Okay. Even in terms of, if I'm designing a research project, I'm looking for, well, what literature am I missing here? I've got some literature. Is there other literature in the field? Okay. So we can use, different tools to actually, to suggest academic papers, to summarize papers for us, also to identify potential gaps in the literature. Okay. So lots of ways that, but I think, again, what we've got to be careful there is that we are not outsourcing critical thinking. Okay. So if we think about doing research, critical thinking is obviously absolutely key. And what we don't want to be doing is dumbing down our process. What I always say to people when they come to my training is you need to intimately get to know your data inside and out. Okay. And so, again, when we're framing our project, that understanding of, what is the literature? What is my research question? Obviously, nobody wants to be collecting data and then later think, oh God, the questions I asked were really flawed, or they weren't good research questions, or there was biases that were actually, really prominent in those questions. So again, we always need to use our critical thinking skills. And so, when we're talking about those kinds of tasks, while we can obviously outsource tasks that are, routine and that are, helping us with efficiency, we need to be thinking about using AI like an intern, okay, or as like an assistant. So AI is not the researcher, you are the researcher, but you can use AI as an assistant. So as I said, you've got those kind of back end tasks, and then, you've got your data. So for example, then using AI to transcribe that data, incredibly helpful and incredibly efficient. The next step then is actually the analysis of the data. And that's where I think we need to be, really careful. So, one of the things I would do is if I was using AI as an assistant in data analysis, I would analyze my data first and then maybe ask AI to do an analysis on the data to see, are there any fresh angles, or is there anything I kind of missed, anything that's quite useful, anything that can kind of, pique my thinking, that I can go back into the data and look at it again. I think there's a real danger of because there's a lot of kind of, I suppose, discussion in the field and in different domains, and also in grey literature around, is it helpful, for example, to get AI to, do the analysis and then you do the analysis? But obviously the problem there is you're going to have the AI has really, really informed your thinking and how you interpret the data. So I think it's really important to actually sit and work through that analysis yourself, and then perhaps then bring an AI to look for those different angles. And then, after we've done the analysis, then the next step then is actually writing up your research. And again, AI can be incredibly useful for helping structure our writing, helping with, when our kind of, when our writing is a bit messy, or, with lots of different ways that we can have, that writing support. So it might just even be refining what we've done, okay, or saying, there's ways that we might be able to improve our writing. We can also use AI as, for visual tools. So again, you could put the data into AI and say, okay, here's some data, put this into a table for me, or a visual representation. So lots of incredibly helpful tasks. But I hope what I'm kind of illustrating is all of those tasks are the kinds of tasks that we could outsource to a smart assistant. We wouldn't actually be getting them to do the job.
Are you still running in circles trying to figure out how to actually grow your business with AI? Maybe your company has been tinkering with large language models for a year or more, but can't really get traction to find ROI on Gen AI. Hey, this is Jordan Wilson, host of this very podcast. Companies like Adobe, Microsoft, and NVIDIA have partnered with us because they trust our expertise in educating the masses around generative AI to get ahead. And some of the most innovative companies in the country hire us to help with their AI strategy and to train hundreds of their employees on how to use Gen AI. So whether you're looking for ChatGPT training for thousands or just need help building your front-end AI strategy, you can partner with us too, just like some of the biggest companies in the world do. Go to youreverydayai.com/partner to get in contact with our team, or you can just click on the partner section of our website. We'll help you stop running in those AI circles and help get your team ahead and build a straight path to ROI on Gen AI. So a lot of things to unpack, but where my mind was going to as you talked about this is kind of drawing parallels. I mean, it's pretty unrelated, but I'm pulling out some things in this, right? So when I think of like AI assisted drug discovery, right? Like very different than qualitative research, but you read all these stories now about what this could mean, right? Oh, it could, mean instead of waiting, 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars for a new drug, it could be a year and, 10% of the cost. When it comes to research, specifically qualitative research, how might proper and responsible AI, change what's possible in our society, right? Does this just mean we're going to get, better health and business outcomes? Does this mean like we're going to get products that are much more personalized for people? Like, what does this ultimately mean? Like, if this is implemented in the right way, like how might, AI really change qualitative research, and what does that look like for us?
So I think, again, as I said, I think that, if we think about the actual analysis as a central part of a research project, I think that really needs to be human led. But I think that then the tasks that go before that, the tasks that come after that, incredible in terms of speed and efficiency, identifying gaps, synthesizing literature, identifying possible ways that this research could be extended, what would be some kind of next step for this research. Also, I think one of the problems that academia can often have is that it's often what academics produce is not necessarily accessible for a lay audience. And that's incredibly problematic because, research is about people and it's about meaning. So it's really important that that meaning actually is able to be accessible to communities, that recommendations can actually be implemented. So when we talk about things like accessibility and implementation, there can absolutely be barriers there. And academics, like everyone else, have got a million things to do and are often under pressure, to publish. There's pressure, for outputs. There's often teaching and lots of work, that's required. And that can really limit people's capacity for, looking at ways that we can actually make research more accessible. So I think in terms of accessibility, I think AI is incredible because, we can use those tools to kind of tailor our, here, okay, this is my findings. I've done the analysis. Okay, how can I make this accessible for a lay audience? How can I make this accessible for this particular community? How can I make this accessible for a policy paper? So, that kind of translation of research into practice. Thinking about, say, implementation, thinking about recommendations. So again, what we can see is the central kind of core work of a researcher is the task of doing the actual research, which is literally sitting down and analyzing the data. And within a qualitative paradigm, that is fundamentally interpretive work. So we recognize the interpretation, the subjectivity, and the interpretation of the researcher are absolutely central to that. Okay, so getting AI to do the analysis is kind of at odds with that philosophical underpinning of qualitative research. But nonetheless, there are a lot of other tasks that are required when we do a research project. And as I said, even those steps of, disseminating to wider audiences, that is not something that is necessarily always done, but it's something that is incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. And that is something that AI can massively assist with.
So, throughout this conversation, you've kind of broken down the qualitative research process into a couple of different, big bucket categories. And, what I'm picking up on is you're talking about, transcription or, transcribing interviews, collecting data, analysis, identifying themes, writing the actual research paper, right? It seems like there's already some, some no-brainer ways on safe and effective ways to implement AI and still, uphold, the qualitative research process. But what happens as these models get better and better, right? So, although they're newer, we do have these, models that can kind of, have this chain of thought, this thinking, this reasoning, right? Is probably not yet there to where we need for the level of research that we're talking about. But what happens as these models do get more robust and more capable and better with their analysis and identifying themes, right? So how might the role of and the kind of day-to-day of qualitative researchers, how might it change?
For sure. So I think there's a couple of cautions I'd like to mention there. So one is, okay, so just when we think about what AI does, we're talking fundamentally about pattern recognition, okay? And we're talking about things that happen frequently in the data. So what you're kind of noticing is those things that happen more frequently and identifying patterns, okay? It's not actually making meaning. It's using an algorithm or a statistical, frame to be able to kind of generate meaning and give that back to you. With qualitative research, frequency is not an indication of importance. Okay, so that's one thing that's really, really key. And secondly, often we find that there are biases. So if we think about obviously a large learning model, it's been fed all of this data, and often the data that's been fed, there can be a lot of biases. So things that may be, for example, racial bias, sexist bias, homophobic bias. So we really run the risk of actually perpetuating biases in the data and noticing what is happening frequently. Okay. So, we're not so interested in it. Look, again, it depends on what kind of, I don't want to kind of get too technical here, but it also kind of depends on what type of qualitative research and really what our research question is. So if let's say I was doing an evaluation of how people felt about a training, okay, really what I want is like a topic summary. I want a summary of people's responses, okay? So something like that, where really what we're looking for is that kind of more surface level summary would be so useful to put into AI, okay? Because what we can have is, okay, this is the majority of people felt like this, other people felt like that. These were some kind of core things that people talked about, okay? With kind of, a qualitative kind of philosophy, what we're actually talking about is not so much what is talked about, but how things are talked about, okay? So we're often looking at things like, silences or contradictions and, complexity in the data and that kind of depth in the data. And it's not what comes across many, many times, but it's things that are, it's kind of how things are spoken about or kind of patterns across the data that don't actually speak to frequency, if that makes sense. Okay. So that I think is where human interpretation is really key. And so, the kind of work that I would do with qualitative data is do a line by line coding. So what you're effectively doing is you're pulling a data set apart. So imagine like you've got a jumper or something, you pull the thread, you've unraveled the entire thing, right? You pull the data set apart and then you're actually rebuilding it in a different form from the ground up, okay? And that rebuilding enables you to start seeing different things in the data that weren't kind of obvious. So I kind of think of it a little bit like pulling back a veil, okay? So often like things that are kind of, implicit in the data that are more that kind of latent level meaning. Can I just give you a quick example?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I did an analysis on women's magazines. So what I was interested in was how is sex constructed in women's magazines and what are the implications for women in terms of sexual health? So we're talking about sexual health, the ability to, negotiate condom use, for example. Okay, so basically so sitting down so I had like 12 months of women's magazines and I identified all of the articles that were about sex and did kind of a line by line coding on all of those articles and then did the process that I just mentioned. So kind of rebuilding it in a different way. Okay. And so when I did that analysis and I would present that analysis at conferences or whatever, talk to people about it, people would say to me, now I understand why I hate women's magazines, but I've never been able to articulate. Okay. So it's like that thing of something that you kind of think, there's just something here, but I'm just not sure what it is, right? Like they're supposed to make you feel good. They're supposed to be about, freedom and independence, but they're just a bit yuck. And it's hard to put your finger on what that actually is. And so what my overarching theme of that paper was, it was something that was actually really, really small. So I ended up on one overarching theme, which permeated the entire data set, okay? Now, that is not something that I believe that if I'd put that data into AI, it would have given me a very different analysis. And so I think as a qualitative researcher, what you don't want is to tell people what they already know. What you don't want is to summarize data. You want to be able to pull back the veil, okay? You want to try and identify that implicit meaning in the data. And to be able to do that, again, our human interpretation is absolutely central. And as I said, that kind of, unraveling and entirely pulling the data apart, rebuilding in a different way. And so, one of the things I mentioned to you earlier, Jordan, was just that qualitative research is inherently time consuming. It's messy. you have moments as a researcher where you just feel like, oh my God, this feels like an absolute dog's breakfast. And I think as you're working through an analysis, if it doesn't feel like a dog's breakfast, you're actually doing something wrong, because that kind of messiness and that kind of fog that can happen at many stages during an analysis are actually an inherently important part of doing qualitative research. Okay. So it is that kind of, deep thinking and that kind of critical thinking and, being able to sit in that mess, being okay with the ambiguity, being okay with the mess and working through, that enables us to come out the other side. And as researchers, one thing I always find when I do an analysis is I have moments where I'm like, it's like when you're reading a novel and you have that plot twist and you're like, oh my God, I didn't see that coming. And that's what doing good qualitative research should feel like. Okay. You've done your interviews, you've talked to people, you're familiar with everything the data says at a real surface level. When you actually sit down, you do that really deep thinking work of doing the analysis, you always have those aha moments where you're like, oh my God, I did not see that coming. And so that is the beauty of being a qualitative researcher and then being able to share that with other people. And it really resonates. But again, it's that kind of behind the veil or that more implicit meaning in the data. And what we don't want to do is lose that to efficiency, which is something different.
All right, so we've covered a lot in today's conversation, Claire. But as we wrap up, what's your one most important takeaway when it comes to thoughtful AI use in qualitative research? Whether that's advice for qualitative researchers or just what you think is most important for our audience to know, maybe as we are consuming the benefits or consuming what happens because of qualitative research. What's your one most important takeaway?
Like, I think it is reflexive practice where, we are understanding that subjectivity is really important as qualitative researchers, keeping our own lens. So again, that human lens, that human interpretation, but really being able to use AI as that intern or that assistant that can really help us with so many of those tasks. So I think, that thing of sitting down and kind of mapping out the research process. What are all of the different tasks that, will need to be done? What are the tasks that I can, comfortably outsource to AI and have that kind of, that collaboration between me and AI? What are the tasks that I need to really be in charge of as a researcher? And just being clear on what AI can do, what I can do, and how I can use AI to support me. But I think it's also, everything is very, very new. It's really, really important that we're having these conversations and that researchers are able to, have access to ways to have the conversation, critical thinking, and just critical awareness around, what the capabilities are, but also what some of those limitations are.
I think is an important conversation to have that I think impacts way more of us than we actually might know. So Claire, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share with us on the Everyday AI Show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I really appreciate your time. Thanks everyone for listening.
All right. And as a reminder, y'all, we covered a lot. If you just need the takeaways or if you missed something that was said in there, don't worry. We've got it in our daily newsletter. So if you haven't already, please go to youreverydayai.com. Sign up for the free daily newsletter. If this was helpful, tell someone about it. Repost this. If you're listening on social media, if you are listening on the podcast, please make sure to subscribe to the show. Leave us a rating. And also, more importantly, join us tomorrow and every day for more Everyday AI. Thanks, y'all.
And that's a wrap for today's edition of Everyday AI. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating. It helps keep us going. For a little more AI magic, visit youreverydayai.com and sign up to our daily newsletter so you don't get left behind. Go break some barriers, and we'll see you next time.